Hi, thank you for joining. My name is Jocelyn Hurtado. I am the archivist at the Black Archives, and as part of the Safer at Home series, my session is called Is It True? Tales from the Magic City. And this is where this segment this is where I discuss different stories and different bits of history that people are not sure if it's true, if it's based on fact, and I just discuss it and just tell you what the facts are, a little bit more information. I just want to give quick shout outs to Kat Dean. I see that you're joining. Hey Alicia. Hey Javelin. Hey Camille. Thank you for joining. I'm really glad to see you guys. I'm really excited. So today's segment is part 2 of Liberty Square. Last week's episode we discussed the history, what caused the creation of Liberty Square, some of the events starting in Overtown, and then we ended it right about 1940s, and then today we're going to talk 1940s to the present. So I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes. Hey guys. Alright, if you have any questions in the meantime, any comments that you want to make or something that you're interested in, please feel free to drop a comment. I'll do my best to answer, and it can be either about Liberty Square or just general Black South Florida history. I'll, any questions, any comments, I'll be more than happy to discuss and let you know if we have information in the Black Archives repository. So I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes. I was a little late today because my stand for my phone broke, so I was trying to figure out how I was gonna have it upright, but got it all figured out, so that was pretty good. Alright. So what I'm doing now, I'm just like making sure I got all the articles, news clippings, whatever I want to show you guys, so you can, I like it to be very visual. I'm a visual learner, so I just want to make sure I have all the information. Give me a second. And oh my god, every time I do a session I always get super nervous because I always forget something. I'm like, oh, I should have gone to this, I should have covered this topic because it correlates and it links up to it. So if you see me looking over my notes, I just want to make sure I didn't forget anything. Hi Miss Brayden, nice to see you. Thank you for always joining us and being part of the conversation. And I actually have a couple questions to ask you because I know last time you commented on a lot of the clauses that were included in the property deeds for for the tenants that live in the Liberty Square area. So I definitely want to get a little bit into that, see if we can get a little bit more information. Okay, so it's about 107, 108. So I'm just going to get started. So for those of you who were not here at the beginning of this session, I'm just going to reiterate my name, my position at the Black Archives, and if you have any questions, please feel free to drop a comment. I'm going to answer them as I go. So my name is Jocelyn Hurtado. I am the archivist at the Black Archives History and Research Foundation, and as part of the Safer at Home series, my segment is called Is It True? Tales from the Magic City, which sometimes I confuse the title to Is It True? Tales from Black Miami, because for me it's synonymous, like Magic City is Black Miami is Magic City. And today is part 2 of the Liberty Square history, and specifically the segregation wall. And I'm just going to do a brief recap of what we covered last time. So Liberty Square was developed as the second housing project in the United States, first in the South, in order to compensate for the density issue, the overpopulation issue in Colortown, which is now known as Overtown. And at that time in Overtown, because of Jim Crow laws, people of color were only designated to live in those certain areas. It was Colortown and the black section of Coconut Grove, and which caused the area to become too overpopulated. A lot of the people, the residents that live in Colortown, they were living in shotgun houses that were made out of wood. They had no running water, no electricity, no heating of any kind. And because of that, in the living condition, there was also no sewer lines. There was an increase of health issues such as dengue fever, yellow fever, tuberculosis, and all types of sickness that was going around, and that was just exacerbated by the living conditions that were in that area. You know, the same place where people were walking to get to one street or another was also, you know, the same place where the residents were discarding their waste, you know, their unclean water and things like that. And because of this, a lot of the residents were starting to get sick. And Reverend Coolmer, who was a local of the community and an activist, he pointed this out to a lot of the city officials and also the one of the writers, journalists from the Miami Herald, which led to a 2 weeks expose basically detailing the horrible living condition that Miami's colored community was facing. And he made the argument, if you guys don't do anything, when he meant you guys, the white city officials who were in charge, if nothing was done, then that meant that the same people who were going to cook for you, clean for you, were taking care of your kids, driving for you, since they were sick, that meant that you were going to get sick as well. So something had to be done. And because of the 2 weeks expose, it garnered national attention and actually grabbed the attention of FDR, who was a president at the time at the White House. And in 1933, FDR, made the New Deal, and part of the New Deal was the Public Works Administration, which was specifically created to improve the living condition, transportation needs, also construct very big, large-based projects like the Hoover Dam, the 7 Mile Bridge. And under the Public Works Administration, they actually came down to Miami to do a survey of the living condition and deciding that they were going to build a housing complex, a public housing complex for the Black residents in Miami. So that basically led to the creation of Liberty Square. At that time, Liberty Square was basically placed surrounded by the white neighborhoods, and it's right now, well, the streets where it's bordered by MLK Boulevard to the north, 62nd Street to the south, Northwest 12th Avenue to the east, and Northwest 15th Avenue to the west. And the housing complex had its opening ceremony in 1936, but it was officially opened in 1937. But because where it was physically located and situated right next to that color line, it created a lot of racial tensions between the white community and the Black community. And by 1939, there were already plans to increase the housing units in Liberty Square to expand east, and that did not sit well with the white neighbors around that area. So they actually pleaded with Miami City Commission to do something about it. And what they did was, this was actually authorized by the Federal Housing Authority. They authorized, give me 1 second, let me just quote it. Okay, so they authorized an expansion of 12th Avenue to 70 feet. And they also elevated that street approximately 2 feet in height. And they were going to construct a parkway that was lined with Australian pine and also gumbo limbo trees. And on top of that, there was going to be a wall erected. So when this ad came out, when this announcement came out in a newspaper at that time in 1939, the wall was said to be, it was going to be 4 feet. But because of historical account, oral history, we now know that the walls range somewhere between 6 to 8 feet in height, because it was enough in height that people could not look over. So this is why it's so important to take into account oral history plus anything written accounts, physical history like newspaper reports and things like that, because sometimes it's not telling us the whole truth, and you also have to think about who's reporting it, who's writing it, and this is why archives is so important. So now I did a brief recap. I want to start off where we left off, so basically the 1940s. So I want to talk about who were the families that lived in Liberty Square. And actually the people who live in Liberty Square, they tend to be married couple, and they were actually required to submit a letter of recommendation by their employer saying that they're a well couple who could pay the rent and they were responsible. At the time, there were no living single people living in the housing complex. But it was a lot of families and people who came from blue collar jobs like janitors, school teachers, doctors, lawyers. And at that time, this really created a tight-knit community, a community so much so that, it was not uncommon for, according to oral accounts that I've read about and I've seen in different videos, that, children were often, go to a neighbor's house to eat dinner or lunch. And at times, people really didn't think about locking the doors or anything. It was really a community raising its children. And there was a great sense of community, great sense of pride, because at that time, Liberty Square was the place to be. It was actually even featured in Architecture Digest magazine, where it was, claiming, oh my God, look at this paradise place, ideal place. It had running water, it had electricity. It was still modern, because at that time, people in Overtown were still people who did not move. People were still dealing with not having running water or electricity, walking on dirt road. But here you have this beautiful place with great landscaping, with these picture perfect houses. And so it was a big thing. You live in Liberty Square, wow, there were somebody of noted, like that was just a place to be. And I actually want to bring up a fun fact. The first child, the first baby born in Liberty Square was Claire Greer Lambert, who was born February 11th, 1937. And she was actually the first baby born in a public housing complex. So I think that was a little bit of fun fact, just to divulge. An interesting fact too. The first baby, I actually read a newspaper article. The first baby to be born in the city of Miami was actually a black baby. And I think I covered this in a previous Is It True session, but I thought that was pretty interesting and cool as well. So a lot of people now, when they think about Liberty Square, they think about a lot of the negative stories that were covered in that area. And I really don't want to get into that, because, the way that people talk about this area, it really tends to stick, and that's what you see the public conception is. I want to talk about what an amazing, great community it was, and it still is. There's a lot of emotions, there's a lot of fond memories, and a lot of great, Miami history that is, part of that. So I want to talk about, Liberty Square in the 1950s and how really it was this big sense of community. But however, things began to change after in 1956, the Florida State Road Department decided to basically built I-95 right through the heart of Overtown, basically displacing around 12,000 members of that community. And a lot of those members of that community started to move into Liberty Square, the Liberty City area, and also the Brownsville area. And because of the demographic, once that started, you really do see this white flight. You see people from the Liberty City area, which was a primarily white community, start to leave. Because of racial tension and the changing demographic. And somewhere between the 1950s and the 1960s, the wall became obsolete because there was no longer a need to separate the white area and the black area, because essentially that area demographically was changing into a black neighborhood and a black community, black city. So that's when the wall became obsolete. But during that time, you do hear oral history and recounts of how, some of the kids would climb up on the wall to peek over and things like that, in that nature. And, that, the wall it was a physical barrier. It was there. And interesting enough, at the Black Archives a couple of years ago, the executive director, he actually did the designation report in order to designate the Liberty City Wall, actually the fragments that remain, as a historic place and landmark. So after the wall became obsolete somewhere between the 1950s and the 1960s, there was a big push to tear down the wall, so it was no longer necessary. And then I'm actually going to show you the designation report that was submitted. and it was actually submitted December 5th, 2006. It was written by the executive director of the Black Archives, Timothy A. Barber, and with consultant Ellen J. Yuguchimi. I'm sorry if I butcher that name. Please let me know how you pronounce it. I really can't pronounce it, but this designation report was submitted. I'm going to flip the camera around. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this is a digital copy of the designation report, and as you can see, who it was prepared by, who was approved by, when was it passed, the resolution number, and it says report of the City of Miami Preservation Officer to Historic and Environmental Preservation Board on the potential designation of the Liberty Square wall fragment. And I want to just scroll down a little bit. You see you have your table of contents, location map, why, general information, significant, presence and original appearance, planning context, bibliography, photographs. So this is a map of the location, the site plan. Okay. So talks about the wall, the zoning, and I want to get down to the statement of significance. So it basically states that Liberty Square was built in the late 1930s, and the wall served as a segregation barrier, and that it should be placed in historic designation because it's part of that. It's part of that history. It's part of Miami history, Black history. And to basically erase that is just to purposely, intentionally leave it out. Even though it's not pretty, it should be preserved. So here it talks about the building of Liberty Square, a little bit about the history, which was I went over, and it also talks about the when the wall was torn down, which is a lot of information we're not certain, but according to this report, it says that the wall was most likely torn down during, give me 1 second, I just want to pull it up right now. Where is it? I just read it. Where is it? Oh yeah, it was torn down. They think during the tenure of Miami Mayor Maurice Ferrer, and the only thing that remains is the fragment. So this is the site of historic event with significant effect upon the community, city, state, or nation. The Liberty Square wall reflects a time in United States history when African Americans and whites were separated by law and customs. The wall fragment is also a visible reminder to the community, city, state, and nation that at one time the nation history and separation of the races was a lawful and matter of course. The remnants of the Liberty Square wall is a tangible symbol of the pervasive indiscrimination once commonplace in America. That can be reiterated. It's not once a commonplace, still a commonplace in America. But, this is what the argument basically saying why it should be preserved. And so it just goes a little bit more into detail, has the cites the sources. And if you're interested in reading this report, you can Google Liberty Square Wall Designation Report. It's going to take you to this site. And then you just click Designation Report and it will just bring it up. All right. And then at this time, I also want you to see a couple other walls that were actually located across South Florida. Liberty Square was not the only segregation wall that existed in South Florida. In Florida, there's also a Pompano Beach wall. Here is the layout. A lot of it is already demolished, but there's still fragment of the existing wall. And then you also have Coconut Groves wall, even though it was not a literal physical wall. What basically happened, there were a lot of streets that were interconnected. So you would have, like, for example, this is the black area, and this is the white area on the other side. But in the grid map, they were purposely, they did not connect. So a lot of people don't know about these other walls. So I just wanted to show you that so you guys can do the research yourself and look at this information. The whole point of this, I really hope this stimulates people's mind, and that it will prompt you to actually look into Miami's Black history. That really, something that the executive director always says, there's nothing new under the sun, is that people just have to, learn about it, read about it, and you would see that. And then here, there's also a lot of great different videos on YouTube discussing the history of the Liberty Square wall. And this is actually, designation report. Unfortunately, at that time, the copies were black and white, so the pictures are not the best quality. So I wanted to show you the fragment of the walls. So here you see the Liberty Square wall fragment. And as you can see, there's like a little bit of elevation between the wall and the actual street level. So I want you to remind you of what I discussed of some of the barriers they put in place, which is they widen the street. So, the street goes all the way to the other side. The elevation rise, so 2 feet elevation. And then also they lined it with Australian pine and gumbo limbo tree in the middle. So there can be a physical landscape barrier as well. Okay. So I'm gonna flip over the camera to me. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. So I know I kind of jump around to the designation report, but I also want to mention that when I-95 was built and there was a displacement of the residents, and some of them moved to Liberty Square, Liberty City, there was basically the same thing happened in the 1930s, happened again in the 1960s. Basically there's a big shift of population, and there was not enough housing. So a lot of these families moved into Liberty Square in the surrounding area, but the housing was not adequate enough to support them. And what the city of Miami did, they tried to build housing, but because of pre-existing building codes and regulations, a lot of the buildings that they built at that time were not the most up to code. They were basically built at a rapid pace. A lot of the contractors didn't care to use better materials. They were looking for cheap materials to build, and over the years they basically sold those properties, left the families in there, and slowly by slowly these buildings started having infrastructure damage. And by the mid-1960s, you really do see, in the mid-1970s, you really start seeing the physical effects of these dilapidated buildings. And that's where you also see the income of the Model City program. So I know I'm kind of going back and forth on little things, but it all really connects, especially the Model City program, which was a housing program, a 5-year housing program that was created to address these issues. And one of the housing programs that they were going to dedicate funds to refurbish and remodel the buildings is the Liberty Square, the Liberty Square housing complex. So if you give me 1 second, I'm actually going to pull up some information. And if you have any questions, please feel free to comment and leave a comment, ask the questions. If I know if I'm talking too fast and I'm going like jumping around, please make sure, if you want any clarification, please make sure to leave a comment. Okay, so I'm gonna flip you guys around again. Okay. So this is information directly from the Black Archives repository. This is part of the Model City program collection that we have. And this basically talks about the program and how the program was created to refurbish, reorganize these communities that were suffering from failing infrastructure, also lack of transportation, lack of health community health centers, and one of the areas of one of the places that they were planning to designate a fund was Liberty Square. So let me just read you a little bit about it. And at that time when this was published, the Liberty Square project reports, actually 1/3 of the population in Liberty City was actually still white. So actually 1/3 was 1/3 of Dade County's black population was living in Model City. So here we go. I'm gonna switch. Okay. The Model City program in Dade County grew out of the congressional legislation, the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1966. The legislation was designed to plan and implement locally initiated program for the improvement of blighted and deteriorating urban areas. So Dade County was one of 63 metropolitan areas throughout the nation selected to participate in the program. And it also talks about a lot of the different programs that we're going to initiate. And the reason I want to get into this, so I'm going to flip you guys over, is because you also have to, a lot of people think, how, if it's, Liberty Square at the time when it was constructed, how did it get that bad? How come the buildings were deteriorated? You also have to think what was going around the country at that time. So you see the construction of I-95 and the plan started in 1956, but the construction actually ended in mid-1960s. So you see this migration of population from Overtown to Liberty Square. But in Liberty Square, in the Liberty City area, there was not enough housing to properly accommodate these families. So you see a lot of people, multiple families living in one area, or multiple generations living in one complex as well. And at the time in the 1960s, you also have the civil rights movement and racial tension, so there were a lot of protests, there were a lot of riots as well. So at the time, you really did not see these buildings being upkept, maintained by the city, because at that time in the 1960s, HUD was overseeing the maintenance of the building, but you did not see any maintenance whatsoever. And by, you also have to think about what was going on in Miami by the 1970s and the 1980s. You also see an increase of population migration, not only from the Cuban migrants, but also from the Haitian communities. So Miami was just basically becoming overpopulated, and a lot of these buildings were built in the 1930s and were not fit to accommodate so many people or for such a long period of time without maintenance. So this is where you really start seeing the failing of the neighborhoods, and then you also see the different demographic change. And by the mid-1980s, there were serious infrastructure challenges and factors that were really affecting the people who were living in this community. So the people who were originally moved there, you have the blue-collar workers, the teachers, the janitors, the lawyers, the doctors. They slowly but surely started moving out to other suburban areas, no longer being restricted by Jim Crow laws, and because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, they were no longer bound to these designated areas. So they started moving elsewhere, and they also moved to other middle-class black communities, black neighborhoods such as Brownsville. So you do see that change in flight of people moving out and new people moving in. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that moved in did not have a did not have a sense of community, or as deep rooted, as deep tied as the original tenants. And because of the situation that was going on at that time, the civil rights movement, there was a lot of things going on that it was just basically out of everyone's control, the tenants' control. And also you see HUD not upkeeping the buildings at all. And by the mid-1980s, you do see the effect. I actually found an article but in the 1980s saying, at that time in 1987, approximately 50 years after the construction of Liberty Square, a lot of the pipes are failing. There was no running water, there was no hot water, there was no gas. So people in that area could not take a shower, they could not cook, there was no gas, and they were actually living in third world living conditions. They would use to carry a bucket, fill it up with water, and then after they used the bathroom, they would just get the bucket and put it in the toilet so it can flush. And these are literally third world living conditions that people were forced to live in the mid 1980s and late 1980s, which is just observed. And that all ties into the history of Liberty Square. When people, like, I just don't want people to think it was just a rapid decline, or Liberty Square was only a brief period of time was living an ideal place. It was a lot of cause and effects that basically put a strain on the building. And also there's a lot of different events that change, like change the history of Liberty Square as well. And Ethan Payne, thank you for joining us. I know last week you had a question. I believe your question was, let me think if I can remember correctly. I believe your question was it why did the wall come down, I believe. And my answer to that, the wall came down because at that time, when by the mid-1950s and in the 1960s, the Black population of Miami started moving to other areas besides Liberty Square. They were people were starting to buy houses in the white section of Liberty City and the surrounding area, which created a white flight. And because of that white flight, a lot of the demographic in the area began to change. And because of that, the wall basically was obsolete. There was no use for it if, the people over the wall were Black and the people on the other side of the wall were Black. And surely but slowly the wall lost its purpose, so it was decided to be demolished. And according to the designation report, it is believed that the wall started to come down during let me get the mayor's right name. Let me see. I have so many windows open. Okay. The wall came down. Okay, here we go. The wall came down during Miami's Mayor Maurice Ferris' term. It's believed that's when the wall came down. So we're not that certain, but that's when it's believed according to different oral history accounts. So yes. And if you look, I don't know if anybody had the opportunity to go into before the new Liberty Square area was redeveloped recently, back in when it was decided to be redeveloped back in 2015. But in the community area, there was actually a small exhibit detailing the history, and it was done by the executive director Timothy Barber. And to the corner of one picture of that Liberty Square, the original Liberty Square pictures, you actually see the wall. Like, it's really small, it's at the corner, but if you hadn't, if you have, you can have an opportunity to go. Okay, so I see I have a question. So it was decided by the city, or was it by the activists? Okay, so technically, according to city official records, the wall was never, like, they had no part in building the wall. And at the same time, we actually can't find no records of who decided to bring it down. So according to records, this wall technically did not exist, and we really would have had no, there's no actual paper evidence of who commissioned it and who tore it down, but it was obsolete. So it is believed activists, and decided to tear down the wall, and that's why you also see the fragments that still remain. And give me 1 second. And give me 1 second. So there's no actual records, but we just know it became obsolete. So it came down. It slowly came down, and there's still the fragments that remain. So at this time, I'm actually going to turn you guys around. So I really encourage you to go to YouTube, look at some of the videos and some of the documentaries they have on Liberty Square, and just mostly because it has great oral history and interviews of the residents that live there, and there's also a lot of great information. And then I also encourage you to go to the Black Archives webpage. I wanted to show you guys this last time, but there was so much information it completely slipped my mind. But I want you to go to our website at BAHLT.org, BAHLT.org, and if you go to visiting BAHLT, if you click there, it's going to take you to the information page for the archives, and you can click to search Black Archives Online Database. And if you go there and click and write Liberty Square, you can see all the collections that are related to Liberty Square and the wall. So it has 3 matching records. You have Carrie Meeks, you have audiovisual, and if you click within the box, it tells you exactly what we have. Not all the research are exactly related to Liberty Square. For example, it pulled up Eunice Liberty National canceled, and that's just because of the word liberty in it. So, but if you go to Neighborhoods and Communities Collection of Black South Florida, you can see that we have a file on Liberty City, and it's from 1978 to 2004. And I also want to make sure, even though you really do see, I also want to mention, not to get it confused, even though you really do see an influx of Black families moving into Liberty City surrounding areas in the 1950s and 1960s, that did not mean Black families never lived there before. In the early 1900s, you actually have Alonzo Kelly, who was a real estate developer, and he actually purchased a couple lands there and started to develop for some of the early Miami's Black families. So we actually have information on him. So there's a lot of things that, a lot of information that is related to Liberty Square and Liberty City. All right. So I actually want to give a shout out to Bobby International and Dinar, because I know they're my family. So I just want to say thank you guys for joining in. And at this time, I actually want to see if I can. Let me just. Hi. Okay, so at this time, I actually want to see if Ms. Brayden is still on. And if you are, if you can just let me know. Because Ms. Brayden, I just want to ask you a couple of questions about some of the clauses that were included in the deed of gift. On the deed, I'm sorry, not deed of gift. Deed of gift is what the archives use when people donate materials. In the deed, when people were purchasing land in Liberty City and Liberty Square area. So I want to see if Ms. Brayden is on. Okay, yes. Ms. Brayden, I know this hasn't been planned, but I see I do have a little bit of time remaining. I was wondering if you'd be willing to jump on the live with me. I'm hoping. I know if it's not, it's okay. I don't want to put you on the spot. I just see that I have a little bit of time left, so I just wanted to see if you'd be willing to jump on the live and talk about that a little bit, really quickly. So, then let me. I'm also okay, Ms. Brayden. So, if you can jump in, jump back out, and send me that request, I'd be gladly appreciate it. Okay, let's see if we get that request in. Okay, I think I got it. And there's so much information that I'm just going over in my mind. Hi, Ms. Brayden.
Hi. I'm in my kitchen cooking.
Sorry, Ms. Brayden, just to put you on the spot, but I saw I just had a little bit of time, so I just wanted to ask, but I'm really glad you said okay. I'm sorry if I interrupted anything, but I was just going to say if it was okay. Not, it was fine.
Yeah, I'm just cooking, that's all.
So just really quickly, if you can just give me like a minute of your time, if you can just explain a little bit about the deed. And you're a rock star, Ms. Brayden, and everyone is so excited to see you.
So
yes,
you want me to talk about the deed?
Yes.
So my parents purchased a property. We lived in Overtown, of course, right down the street from the Lyric. And when my parents decided to purchase, because of the expressway coming through, They purchased their home in 1959, just so it would be 66 between 11th and 12th. So that's just to the east of the wall that you were discussing. Um, and what I remember my father saying, because I was little at that time, my father said that the man that built the home for him, because they had a house built on that street, it was a white Jewish man, and he was a contractor. And what he did was he purchased the land because the land had a deed restriction that blacks, or at that time colors, could not purchase the home, or purchase land, I should say, in that area. Because it was mostly whites in that area. So the guy who was building, the contractor, purchased the land, and then he sold the house to my parents. And so the other interesting thing, and I think it was you or someone touched on it earlier, my parents, when they went to get the loan to build a house, they would not allow my mother to be on the loan because she was a female. And although she had a master's degree, was hired by the school system, and my father was a maintenance person at Pan Am, they only allowed him to be on the loan. So the gentleman that built the house for them, the contractor, had to give them a second loan in order to be able to afford the house. So it was pretty strange that, she had the degrees and made the money and had been working in the school system since the 1940s, and this is 1959, and she could not purchase because of the deed restrictions on the property. My brother still lives in that property, our home property, and as I said, it is just half a block east of that wall that you talked about.
Yeah, that's really, I bet at that time, they did receive a lot of backlash from the white neighbors.
Yes.
A lot of, yes.
Yes, so about 2 blocks to the north of where we lived, and right over by what is currently Northwestern High School. And you should really do something on that. It was called Little Korea. I know you all have a lot in the archives. I have several friends that lived there during that time, and the whites did not want them moving in. It was private apartments, and so they would bomb it. Yeah, I think that would be an interesting one for people to know about also.
Yeah. I've heard of Little Korea, and I've also heard of Little Baghdad, which is really interesting. It's names that were taken on to describe bombings of Black neighborhoods, and it just correlates with the national events that were going on at the time, but it was accurately describing what was going on. It was basically a war zone.
Yeah.
And so yes, that's definitely a segment I'm actually gonna look into doing. Thank you once again, Ms. Brayden. I'm not gonna keep you too long. I know you're cooking, and I really appreciated that you joined. You guys are always awesome and always so full of information. Like the archives department, I just want you to know that adores you guys. You guys are mentors. And thank you again. So with this, I'm just gonna end it and basically talk about, Liberty Square. A lot of you who don't know, Liberty Square was redeveloped easy, and there's a lot of opinions about the redevelopment with its current tenants, its future tenants, the future of Liberty Square, the preservation of its history, and what's going to happen. What's going to happen to that history? What's going to happen to the tenants? Are they going to be relocated, or is it going to be served for the Black community? Is it not? Is it, what are its plans? So since that's modern history, I'm really not going to go into it, since a lot of that information is easily available online, and you can research that yourself. You can go to Miami Herald archives, or just Google it. You're going to see a lot of news reports that being published basically within the last 3-5 years. So you can do a little bit of research on that. But I just really want to talk about the historical part.
Well, let me know if you want any other assistance. I did work in housing when I was working, and so I did do some work in those 2 areas. So I'll be happy to provide you with any information.
Yes, actually, I'm like, housing is always such a fascinating topic, especially housing programs and how those function and the history of the housing programs. And it's something definitely we want to talk about it. Trust me, I know the archives department, Alicia and Louis right now are thinking like, oh my God, housing, how can we get Miss Brandon back on and talk about housing, you know? So,
So,
I just wanted to thank you a lot for joining us. I hope this information session was really informative. And I know my time is about to run out. It's almost
okay.
going to be an hour. But thank you again, Ms. Brandon. Have a good day. Thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions, please feel free to submit. And if you have any questions for Ms. Brandon, please feel free to leave a comment and we'll get back to you. All right.
Okay.
Have a good
Bye.
Monday. Bye.